holiday frazzle. Anyone is welcome to chime in. Okay, so yeah, it's gonna pop at the top. You can tell it okay, and we'll get started after I leave YouTube. So So, hello, everyone. I'm gonna talk us through a paper. I don't have a slides for this, but we're gonna just walk through the paper and explain how this worked and answer any questions about it. So I will share the link to the paper if anybody wants to follow along, but I'm literally going to walk you through it. All right, so you can see the name of the article is Developments of Culturally Appropriate Text Message Booster Content to Follow Brief Intervention Focused on Reducing Alcohol-Related Harms for Injury Patients in Moshi. What does that mean? So most of you know at this point that we did an intervention, and this view turns out to not be the best because you can't see it as well. An intervention for folks coming to the emergency department at KCMC in Moshi. And the intervention is a brief intervention that's not described in too much detail here because you'll have to look at another paper for that, which was adapted to the context to take advantage of this teachable moment where someone has had an injury and either most of the time the injury is involving alcohol, or they could just be someone who has risky alcohol use patterns prior to the injury, and they happen to have this injury. So we use this opportunity to intervene, to use what's called motivational interviewing, which highlights the individual's own interests and values and point out how those are maybe misaligned with their current behavior and work on getting them to set some goals to align those things, the behavior and their values, what's important to them more closely. And so we hypothesize that in addition to that brief intervention, which is usually like only 15 or 20 minutes with a nurse, text messages sent after the intervention when the patient is discharged and goes home will improve any effect or may at least sustain any effect that the intervention has. So how do we do that? Is described in this paper. And I'm going to go through it quickly and we can maybe have some more discussion because that's my favorite part. And as the presenter, I have that privilege. So of course we describe a lot of the problem of harmful alcohol use, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. We know that injury and the negative effects of harmful alcohol use are disproportionately shown in low and middle income countries and in sub-Saharan Africa. So while other areas of the world may have higher rates of consumption, they're facing the more of the negative effects. And that's of course true with injuries in general. We know that low and middle income countries are having a disproportionate share of injuries and injury related deaths. So we have some of the data there, which I'm not going to go into because that's not exactly the purpose of this paper, but just to say there is a problem. And at the hospital that we've been working in, it varies from population to population, but we have found in some previous work that about 30% of the trauma patients showing up at the emergency department test positive for alcohol. So there's a big opportunity to hit this population at that point in the emergency department. And let's talk a little bit about mHealth or mobile health. Some people now are preferring to call it digital health. And this seems like a good opportunity because we know that phones capable of text messages are ubiquitous. So it's kind of something that people are carrying around all the time that can be leveraged for good. In this case, we hope. So again, we talk a little bit about the intervention, which I described, and then get into how we did this. So this was done in a couple of different phases. We first looked at the literature to identify the kinds of messages that maybe were used previously for this kind of work to promote safer drinking behaviors. So we created a pool of messages that we might use on these themes of self-awareness, goal setting, and motivation related to safer drinking behaviors. So these were in English to begin with. And then if there were any things that needed to be kind of culturally adapted, we had our Tanzanian research team do that at that point to the English version. And I'm going to show as we go through an example of how that looked. So so yes, this was his first phase. This is probably a good place to summarize. Of the literature review, the content analysis, SMS development, and then we went to the more complex second phase, which had multiple different pieces. So we of course translated it into the most commonly spoken language of Swahili, and then we always do forward translation and back translation. And typically like kind of a focus group type discussion about those, especially where there's discrepancies, but even where there's not, we kind of want to get a lot of different perspectives to see what's going on there and try to reach consensus and continue to adjust and iterate until that consensus is reached. Or sometimes that's an indication that we just need to throw out that content if it's just not working. Because maybe it's more than just a language issue, maybe it's more of a cultural issue. And then the content evaluation. So once the consensus was reached on the translations, we had some expert judges who would be medical doctors, professors, researchers who understood both English and Swahili, who had some kind of knowledge in the areas of mental health or injury or psychology, to make sure that the content was clear, was relevant and faithful to the area, the theme that we were getting at, and was culturally appropriate in Swahili. So we had to rate all of the messages on those criteria to get kind of a quantitative summary. And then we also sort of open-endedly asked them if there was some shortcoming, what would they suggest to improve it? And then we also asked them to rank the messages in terms of their quality, and anything that was a low ranking, we wanted to get edits on, and maybe we would consider removing those ones that had a low rating. And then after that, we focus grouped and edited them and with a group of those expert judges to make sure that we could kind of get a consensus on a final version. And then, of course, we piloted. This was great fun because we got to pilot not only the content, but a little bit on our SMS service and our SMS system and learned a lot about that. So first, we made sure that we could even do this like technically. So sending them to like our staff to say, okay, are we getting the message? Can you actually read it? Or is it one of those things where when you receive the message, it breaks it into 2 or 3 messages and it becomes confusing if they're sent out of order or something like that? So kind of technical testing. And then also we enrolled patients themselves to receive the messages and tell us if they thought the message was clear or understandable, if it was appropriate, and if they thought it would have any impact on their behavior if they were in this intervention. Yeah. A little bit more on data collection details, and then some results. I kind of want to show, I'm gonna pause at this point and show you guys one of the examples of the movement of these things through the phases. I think we have that as a supplement to this paper, which you could also download when you go to the website. It may be a little bit difficult to follow. Don't worry about understanding every little detail. But this is going to show some of the iterations. And I think the takeaway that if I were to tell you what one of the big takeaways from this would be for anyone looking to develop any kind of intervention, adapt even any kind of intervention, or just kind of use it with a different language, it's pretty much going to be more complicated than it seems at first. You know, if it's not seeming like a challenge, then I would wonder if you're doing it right, right? So just keep that in mind. You know, we always want to allow for plenty of time and patience to go through these things. I know it's difficult for folks who don't understand Swahili, but you can even get an idea of it when you just look at the different English versions. And then there's some summaries of comments in these. Again, you can look at these on your own. One that we always like to point out is this one where I guess I'm not showing you the furthest column. This was the original English. Identify triggers that make you want to drink and try to find alternatives. Write them down. So of course we translated that into Swahili. Okay, cool. But we found when we were discussing this that the writing them down didn't really convey in the same way that it would in our country. So, you know, it's typical for us to say, okay, like me, myself, if I write something down, it's actually my way of remembering it. Not because I'm going to look at it later, but because actually writing it down sort of commits it to memory. But also it's that note that you can keep with you. But what we found is that's not really a very common practice among our patient population. So we thought, okay, we need to do something different. You can see the note here. Need to come up with something other than write things down, and that was repeated in the expert meeting. This other version says make a list so you can remember them, but even that, I don't believe that made it into our final list because it didn't. It was just not the best one, which is why we wanted to start with a larger pool. One thing that we don't get into a lot in this paper is personalized text messages. So that's another component, which hopefully we'll be able to get some data on soon. The question of if we personalize these messages, will they be even more effective? So I can show you an example of that as well. But I think if you look through these comments, you'll find some interesting things where some of them you might expect, like the standard drink. So it talks about standard drinks in this one. But I mean, even here, a lot of people don't understand what is standard drinks. There's some countries that are like, have really good marketing, and even their beverages, like if you buy a can of beer, it might say this is 1.1 standard drinks or something, which is pretty cool. Or this has X units of alcohol, even in the grams of like pure alcohol. But if you're not in a place that does that, most of us don't really understand what is a standard drink. So those are the kind of things that we have to look out for. But some of them might surprise us, like stress comes up in line 14. Or again, like I said, the one about writing things down. There's another one that had writing it down. So it's funny that that's come up more than once. This one had something about don't let drinking get in the way of a better you. But this idea of a better you was difficult to translate. So we needed to work on that one. And then again, as I said, the personalized ones are here as well. If you'd like to look, it doesn't have the English next to it, I don't think, unless it's in another tab. So this is a bonus for you all that understand Swahili. But this would be where we would do things like using what was mentioned in the intervention with the nurse and the patient, where they set those goals, like this one. I think that's what's happening here. You had this goal of whatever the person said. So really adjusting it to them, not just personalizing it by putting their name on it, kind of generically, but actually taking from their story and putting it back to them. Hey, you had a goal of being there for your family. You wanted to reduce your alcohol to be there for your family. Keep that in mind, and maybe that would be motivating for people. So you all can look at more in detail at that if you like. It is published with the paper. Let's go back to the paper for some last things, and then I would love to hear some more thoughts and discussion from you guys. There's some good examples of some of those themes summarized here that I walked you through. Some of them are quite simple, but again, others might not be so obvious on the surface. So this would be a challenge in any language, I think, many languages anyways, where clarity. If the text message said drinking, it doesn't always imply drinking alcohol, right? But sometimes we have a tendency to just refer to drinking. So let's make sure we put alcohol anytime that's there. There's some more examples of the revisions as well. So yeah, again, I guess my takeaway came from this paper, right? Culturalization requires a rigorous iterative process. If we're simply putting something, certainly in an AI translator, not involving humans, but even if we're, doing an excellent word for word translation, it's not enough. We need to iterate. We need to rigorously think critically about this information and involve people who know what they're talking about in terms of the content, in terms of the population, including our target population themselves. And of course, mixed methods are going to be a great way to do that. If we're only looking at it quantitatively, we're likely to miss something. Same thing, if we were only looking at it qualitatively, I suppose. There are a lot of limitations here. It was noted here that yes, Swahili was widespread, but there is a limit that it's not 100% of the patients that we treat would do this. There's literacy concerns as well. And just because we translated this into Swahili and a culture in Tanzania doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to just be something that we can pick up and take to Kenya or another place that might speak Swahili, but they have some different nuances. We'd have to test that theory. And again, as I said, the versions and summaries of the feedback are included in the publication that's open for everyone to see, as well as some other information. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. I did put the link to the paper in the chat, and I'll see if our lead author and PI would like to add anything, or if anybody else would like to say anything that I missed.
So I'd like to ask Ashley to send that again, that link in the
Oh,
chat,
sure.
that paper link in the chat. And then I want to ask everybody who's online to go take a look at the paper. What this does is it registers the checks to the paper when you go on and take a look at it. So when you present your paper in Gemini, we will do the same. And so everybody online, please do the same as well. This gets people to check out your paper because it's a more accessed paper. So nicely done to all. Part of the basis for this is because this is a 15-minute brief intervention in person. How could you possibly have a life-sustaining behavior change after only 15 minutes, right? Well, the 15 minutes is supposed to get you to think about something. And then the text messages conceptually are supposed to reinforce that behavior as you're doing the hard work of behavior change. That's the goal. We'll see if it actually works out. Part of what I think that we did an okay job at, but one of the things you do when you do research is you always critique your own work. And I think we could have done better, is that we came to this as an English to Swahili translation, both in language and in culture. So I think that there are some foundational cultural perspectives in Tanzania that we might not have brought to the surface because of how we did this. And so I would like to challenge our Tanzanian and Swahili speaking colleagues that you guys need to lead the next one, coming from a Swahili perspective, not a US perspective or translation, because part of what we're doing is ascribing a US and English process to something that doesn't have to be. And we have enough knowledge and experience at this point to be able to say, okay, let's start this in Swahili. And make sure that we're getting the context and the process and the ideas correct, but it's really coming from the Swahili language, nothing else. So it's a little bit more challenging, but I think that that would be the goal for doing the next process. Otherwise, Ashley, thank you for presenting this. This was nicely presented.
Great points. Any other questions or comments? Love to hear from others who have been involved in any other cultural or translation activities, any lessons learned, pitfalls, advice for others. Don't be shy.
Actually, I have a question slash a comment. I think this is a great process, and I'm happy that you have shown us what you did throughout. First question is, has the SMS poster already been incorporated into the PPKY? Like, is it been done? And if it's being done, I want to know like the frequency of the message. Like, how do you decide like when to send the message? Or will it be in part of the personalization process? And do you send what message at what time? Like,
Great questions. So the quick answer is yes, it's being done. Remember, the PRACT trial is a two-stage trial where the first one is comparing PPK plus text-based booster to usual care, and that is complete, showing an evidence of behavior change. The second phase is comparing just PPK to the PPK plus boosters, and that trial component is ongoing. So we should be able to understand if these boosters do give a prolonged improvement in behavior change or have more behavior change ultimately, or in reverse, don't have less because we're an inferiority trial. But the second question is really interesting. So how did we decide? I can tell you how we decided, but I can also tell you how I would want to decide in the future. And those are two different things. We decided based upon most drinking patterns. When we took a look at drinking patterns, it was again very much weekend drinking, so Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and that's typical around the world, but more so in the data that we were seeing. And so we wanted to reduce binge drinking and weekend heavy drinking, which was cause of injuries, and therefore chose a time period on Thursday or Friday where you would get a reminder as close as possible to the time period where we needed you to change your behavior. Now, is that perfect? No, because some people drink every day. And so it is what we chose because we had like our outcome in mind. That being said, I think that there are some people who might want more and some people who might want less. So I would like a responsive process where like you can choose how much you get and you can move it up or down based upon sort of what your needs are for the intervention. That would be cool. It's not what we did, but we really are there to show efficacy first, and then we can play around with the fine tuning of the process that's really patient-centered.
Yeah, I just put a link as well for a related paper, which looked at the feasibility of using this SMS system for this purpose. So before we started the trial, we did a smaller pilot feasibility trial. And one component of that was looking at sending the messages. So you'll see in that paper, our aim was to send the messages on Friday, but mostly due to technical issues, like someone's phone is off, they're out of the cell service area. The messages were not always sent on Friday because the way that the technology works is if it can't send it now, it will keep attempting for like 48 or 72 hours until it's successful. So you can see, you know, when most of the messages were received in that trial. Feasibility trial, yeah. Great questions. Other comments or questions?
Thinking about the paper that we submitted and we're working now to address the comments, etc. One of the reviewers were discussing on the priming effect that receiving the text messages would have on the person doing the self-disclosure alcohol consumption later. And saying if there was any other thing that we would have done or to try to avoid that, but at least that of course you can say differently, but I think that we have our limitations, but for the setting that we're dealing with, like people having challenge coming back to the health system and actually receiving the intervention face to face and costs and all of that, I think it's something that there's not much to do about that.
That's a really good point. I hope everyone understood what he's getting at, but yeah, especially when we're talking about a trial, when we're trying to measure outcomes, when we're kind of giving people the right answers, so to speak, that we're saying, you know, hey, reducing is what we're going for, then those who are getting the messages are going to be more likely to report reductions, whether they're real or not. Any thoughts on how to overcome that? I think I tend to agree with Joao. There's only so much we can do.
I mean, I'm not sure if we're not empowered maybe to do that, or it's a system analysis or something, but we have the usual care group, right, which doesn't get the SMS messages. But then we also do have, we send a message for a year, but we do follow the patient for 2 years, right, for the 24 months. Maybe that's something to consider and look at, but at least to our like main outcome, which was in 3 months, I think it's something that's just it's gonna maybe happen, or
I mean, we can't prove that it happened. We can't prove that.
Yeah, that happens. That's a question that comes up sometimes with really any alcohol related work, is if you're not taking like biological samples, and even if you are, there's challenges. But if you're not taking like blood alcohol or something, which is, what are you gonna take it every 6 hours or something? You know, there's no gold standard. There's no great gold standard, you know. Or it has to be self-reported, right? As part of the challenge.
And I guess it's too much into the paper, etc. But like maybe if we looked into something, if the main outcome was the consequences of drinking, maybe that's something to look at.
Because it's a bit more.
It's harder for you to
black and white.
Like,
yeah.
If you ask the patient how many drinks they have in the last 2 weeks, they're not gonna say like only one. If you ask them like, have you had a consequence? Have you?
That's a good point.
You have a conflict, or maybe that's something that's less sensitive to.
That's definitely.
And part of this can focus on that. That's part of the drink audit paper that we want to do. And part of the reason is because I get hungover at a half a drink. right? Like, welcome to being old. But the consequence of that for me is higher, right? And so maybe I shouldn't be drinking as much. And so a half a drink is what I can handle, not the two that NIAAA recommends. So every person is different, and then the consequences are more personalized and challenged that you want to stay away. So I like that. But then some people are probably not, there's going to be a bias against consequences or a stigma against consequences that is higher than overall number of alcohol drinks, right? There are some people who, like, through machismo will say 6, even though they drink 2, just because that is, you know, cool thing to do, is drink 1, right? So I think it can go both ways,
Yeah.
depending on the population that we deal with.
It's a great question. Great point.
And a
Couple of
challenge to deal with, for sure.
couple of things to highlight from the chat. Gabby says, yeah, the cultural adaptation is fascinating. When I first read the paper, some of the messages made sense to me, like understanding their intention, but it wouldn't have had the same impact if they were translated into Portuguese, for example. And oftentimes there's really no adaptation because it just doesn't fit the local context, which is totally right. And then Bruna points out something about languages, and particularly oral versus written language, you know, saying that in Bolivia, they have many native languages and some are passed down orally, with written forms being developed only relatively recently. So can you imagine the challenge of doing that work in those languages? Another question from William: could the participants send a reply to the message they got?
Yep.
Yeah, they could. That's a great question, and it goes to kind of some of the thing that Catherine was saying. They could reply. We did not. This was not intended to be interactive, but you could see from the responses that a few patients may have expected it to or hoped it would be, based on their responses. Mostly, I think if I recall correctly, at least in the pilot part, the responses were sort of bimodal. The people asking to stop, which you would expect, and then people, you know, saying thanks for the message or whatever. But if we could do something like, you know, leveraging new LLMs and do a chat bot, or if there was an app where, like, that's what I was thinking when Catherine was commenting, like, if it said, you know, here's the message, want to talk more, click here, and it opened a web app or something on a smartphone, and you could ask questions or have a more discussion with a chat bot, that could be quite interesting for sure. I think a lot of people would like that, but we would certainly, you know, I think everyone has seen some of the pitfalls of LLMs and chatbots, so we would certainly need to have some real good faith that our tool wouldn't cause more harm than good. And then let's see, something from Timothy, just getting the paper, don't know the number of participants that own mobile phones. Someone who owns their phone take seriously than someone else reading the SMS, the credit for delivery of the booster because they are more effective regardless of who owns the phone. I didn't totally follow your comment, Timothy, about the
Yeah,
go ahead.
so yeah, I was trying to say in this population of people who are taking alcohol, they don't own phone because they sometimes lose it during their drink when they're drunk. So the papers speak more, the feasibility papers speak more of the efficacy of the SMS boosters rather than talking about the percentage of people who own phones.
Yeah,
So
Timothy, that's a great statement, and I think it brings up 2 points. The first is, I think that there's an automatic assumption that those who drink alcohol and have risk are those who are at severe alcohol use. I lose my phone and I don't drink. So I think that we also want to think about those who are drinking 2 or 3 drinks as those who might benefit from this intervention. I think this population does lose their phone, but less because they're drunk all the time and more because they just had a crash. So, or had
across the board.
yeah, they just had an injury of some sort, they were just in the hospital. And so there's a higher risk of losing your phone that way. It greatly impeded our ability to enroll in our trial. We did not anticipate those numbers being that high, but they were, which is interesting. So it'll talk to the implementation potential down the line. But I think also there's more of a communal atmosphere in Tanzania than there here is in the States, where some people are okay sharing a phone with someone else and someone else seeing their messages. I would not share a phone with my mother. I would not be okay with her seeing my messages. But that seems like a more common thing to happen in Tanzania. And if that's the case, then maybe it is an okay medium to use either a family member's phone or some other kind of access, rather than expecting them to come back to the hospital. That being said, the population we're dealing with are young, healthy men that travel a lot for work. And so the ability for them to come back to KCMC is very, very low. So any way we can get a hold of them, other than having them re-present at the hospital, I think is a great way. So it's a great discussion. It's a lot to think about. And it's a hard process to sort of think through and think what the best alternative is, because you don't want to share somebody's data on a phone unless they want to share their data on a phone. And at the same time, in the rehabilitation process, it's great to have supporters. And so if you share a phone with someone, they might automatically become your supporter. And at which point that really improves your chance of success and behavior change.
And in terms of logistics as well, the phone is needed
Yeah,
for
makes
the
sense.
SMS and for the follow-ups.
Mhm.
So it's common for our team that they're gonna call the patient and their mother answers and says, hey, he's not here today. And because of that, we basically came up with this workaround that we try to collect as many cell phone numbers as we can with the team, like from the family, from the brother, the sister, etc., that we can try to reach out the patient in any way possible. And this is something that is it's unique and it needs to be considered. If we went there and tried to do a trial with the way that it's done here in the US, which we expect everyone to have their own cell phone, it wouldn't work.
Yeah. And then we do have some patient reported outcomes in terms of like satisfaction and things like that. So for like acceptability, some of that is reported in the feasibility paper that I shared the link to, the second one there. And again, you're gonna have some social desirability bias there, and especially in this culture. But you know, most people said that they were satisfied, that they, you know, think that the boosters, you know, would have had a positive effect on them. We also asked people, I don't think it's reported in the paper, but we did ask people how many messages they were receiving, and how long they were receiving messages for, to the best of their ability to recall, which is a challenge over a year, so that we could get an idea of how much that was actually getting received on the other end. Our SMS technology system tells us, yes, this message was successfully sent to this number, but that doesn't always mean that the person is getting it in the end, or they're opening it, or you know, whatever. So that's some data we could probably look into a little more going forward. Last questions or comments before we wrap up? Well, thanks for listening. Thanks for the questions and